Well, how are we doing today, Rizwan? Virk. I hope I pronounced that right. I didn't even ask before we got started, but
Yeah, no, that's good.
all right,
uh,
good deal.
yeah, doing pretty
Um,
well.
all right. So, welcome to Mysterious Circumstances. I am Justin, and for the listeners, this man right here, dude, I was telling him, I said once I got the email for this interview, I had to take it. He's the author of more than two books, but the two I'm going to mention right now is the simulation hypothesis and the simulated multiverse. And your background is incredibly interesting. I mean, MIT, Stanford. I know you're on a couple boards as well with each of those universities. If not, I know Harvard too. But you're also incorporate like UFOs and I don't even know what they call them now, UAPs, I think. So they keep
Yep.
changing the name, and it's like, yeah, it's the same thing. We all know what it is, but
Yeah,
maybe
it's the same thing, you know. In fact, the term UFO was adopted by the government because the old term flying saucer had, too much science fiction baggage associated with it. And it looks
nice.
like they did the same thing again with UFO, where they
Yeah.
renamed it to UAP.
I love it
But
so much, man.
yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into these topics and how it interested you.
Sure. So, my background is as a computer scientist, and I studied computer science back at MIT. I was a programmer, writing code, and then I became an entrepreneur in the video game industry in Silicon Valley, where I ended up going to business school. And it was really from my work in the video game industry that I started to think more about virtual reality and where it might take us. And one day I had actually sold my last video game company, and I had become an investor as a venture capitalist at that point. And I was visiting a startup in Marin County, which, if you know, is just north of San Francisco and looks out over the bay. And they had made a virtual reality ping pong game. And, I was trying on this headset. The headset was coming from the ceiling with wires. This was a few years ago now. It was 2016. So I guess it was, 8 years ago now. So the technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. It was a heavy headset. You couldn't really mistake the fact that you're in a VR headset. But what happened was that the physics engine of this game was so realistic that at the end of the game, my body was fooled just for a few seconds into thinking I was playing a real game of ping pong, because it really felt that way with the motion. And so much so that I tried to put the paddle down on the table and I tried to lean against the table. And of course, there was no table. It was just this big headset on my head. So the controller fell to the floor. And as I tried to lean on the table, I almost fell over, and I did a double take. I was like, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, of course. And then, that made me realize that as our video game technology gets better, we'll be able to create simulated worlds and video games that are basically indistinguishable from physical reality, something like the Matrix. And so I really started to think about what are the stages of technology between now and then that will take us to that point. And then what does that mean if we ever get to that point? And that's kind of, the initial interest in this topic. And then I found that there was a guy at Oxford named Nick Bostrom who had put out a paper in three. So this is back when the Matrix sequels were coming out. That about, you living in a computer simulation? And he basically came up with a logic that said that if any civilization anywhere ever makes these types of simulations, they'll make a whole bunch of simulated worlds. And because of that, you're more likely to be in a simulated world than a physical world. And this was the logic that same year in 2016, when I was playing the ping pong game, Elon Musk was at the Code conference in somewhere in France, I think. And he basically made a statement that the chance that we are not in a simulation, the chances that we are in base reality, is one in billions, which of course means the chances that we are in a simulation is billions to one. Now, those numbers aren't exact, obviously, but he was just trying to say there's, it's very, very likely that we live inside a simulated world. So anyway, that's what kind of got me into it. And then I started looking at the quantum physics, which is telling us really weird things about the world that doesn't fit a purely physical, materialistic reality. And then I started to look at the religions of the world, particularly the mystics of the religions. The Eastern mystics at first, but really across all the world's major religions. And I realized they're all telling us the same thing, that the world is not real. What we think is physical is just a temporary illusion of a sort. And so I realized that, all of these three areas, the computer science, which was my background, the physics, and the mystics, are all telling us that we basically live inside a fake world, which is kind of like a multiplayer video game. So anyway, that's how I really got drawn into this subject and ended up writing the first book, The Simulation Hypothesis, about it.
So speaking on that book, what conclusion, or not even conclusion, but where did you go with who actually created the simulation, if that is the case?
Well, that's, obviously a tough question, and you get different
Yeah.
answers depending upon which angle you take. Now, there's something that I call that's kind of important in the distinction between the simulation hypothesis and various flavors of it. I call this the RPG versus NPC distinction.
Okay.
Okay. And so NPC is a term that's gotten popular now beyond video games, but it came out of the video game industry, and it stands for non-player character. And usually it means an AI within the game that, it's not one of the main characters. It's just somebody that's there, like a bartender or a bank teller, or even an opponent, right? Or somebody to help you in your quest in the video
Okay.
game. Right, but it's not a playable character. Actually, the original term came out of Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop games, even before there were video games. But the video game industry is where it's known for. Of course, now it's made its way into popular usage as someone who doesn't think for themselves, who just
Yeah.
takes the programming of the media, and that's, we call them an NPC sometimes. But
It
the
fits.
actual term, yeah, so that's pretty popular, right? But the actual term means it's an AI that doesn't have a player. And so the other version is the RPG version, as I like to call it, which is a role-playing game, where there's a player, and the player has a character inside the game, which is called an avatar inside video games, which incidentally is an old Hindu term,
Huh, I didn't know
which means divinity coming down into a body, right? And
that.
so
Interesting.
it was actually these guys at Lucasfilm, the George Lucas, who made Star Wars. His
Yeah.
company had a gaming division, and they created a game called Habitat back in 1986 to 89. This ran on a Commodore 64, and with dial-up modems, with that old sound. But they had these little characters on the screen. It's considered pretty much the first, really well done MMORPG, even though they were just like these tiny 2D characters. And they were trying to come up with a term for, what do we call your character that's moving around? And they said it feels like, we're big people, and we have to basically take ourselves and shrink ourselves into the phone line and go down into this little sprite character on the screen. And so they used this Hindu terms from Sanskrit, which also meant, big divine entity coming down into a small little body. So that's
That's
where the
pretty
term comes
awesome.
from. Yeah. But so those two flavors, they're really flavors, but they're more like an axis. Because if you think of, when most academics talk about simulation, they think everybody's AI in the simulation.
Hmm.
And so somebody might have created the simulation, and they might be watching the simulation. On the other hand, if we think of it as an RPG version, this is closer to the Matrix. Because in the Matrix, Neo and Morpheus and Trinity, they all existed as players, if you will, outside of the game. And then they had their avatars, which looked just like them
Hmm.
inside the game, right? So they were players with characters and avatars. And so depending on which flavor you look at, and by the way, these are not mutually exclusive. In a video game, you can have your player characters, you can have other people's characters, and then you can have NPCs as well, right? So you come out with different answers. And I found that the religious side was closer to the RPG version, because they're saying we have a player, which is like a soul that exists outside the physical reality, right? And we basically watch ourselves playing this game. And in the Eastern traditions, we talk about how in Hinduism and Buddhism, they talk about how once you've completed a life, you go back, you kind of look at the game, and then you go into the next character and you play again and again, and you have multiple lives. But when most academics talk about simulation, they're saying, well, it's just a bunch of AI NPCs. And Nick Bostrom, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote that original paper, he calls it an ancestor simulation. And so an ancestor simulation is if we were to make a simulation of, say, ancient Rome or ancient Greece, right? We're making a simulation of our ancestors. And in a sense, I've talked about the Matrix a lot, but there was another movie that came out in 1999 that was simulation themed. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called The 13th Floor.
No, I haven't. I'm
Uh,
intrigued now though.
yeah, you should watch it if you're
I
into
will.
this topic, which you are.
Definitely, yeah.
It was based on an old book from 1960s called Simulacron 3, which is a science fiction novel. But in it, they're in 1999, and so the same year as The Matrix. In fact, it came out just a couple months later. Of course, it got dwarfed because The Matrix was the
Oh,
most
for
talked
sure.
about
Yeah.
movie of that year. But I actually think this is one of the better representations of the
Okay.
simulation hypothesis. And so in 1999, they made a simulation of 1937 Los Angeles. And inside that simulation, everybody was an NPC who were living their lives. And you could also, the main character, he could also go in and inhabit one of those characters. So it's like taking over,
Oh, that's
like
awesome.
an NPC. But these people thought they were real and they're living in it. And so in that case, it would be more like people who are simulating something to see what would happen, right? In the same way that we simulate the weather. Like, why do we run a simulation of the weather? We want to see what might happen, or
Yep.
a pandemic spread, or traffic, or bank teller, bank traffic, or whatever, or wins and losses in a casino, whatever we might simulate. We do it to figure out what is the most likely outcome, and also what might be the most favorable outcome, so we can tweak the parameters and go back.
Awesome. So in your community, when you wrote the simulation hypothesis, what was the feedback? Did people, a lot of academics just kind of like, why did you write that, man? Like, what the hell are you doing,
Well, so, I was a part of a few different communities, and I still am in a way. There's the Silicon Valley community, which is
Hmm.
more technology centric, right? And then there's the academic community, which is a little more science and philosophy centric, but also tends to have a certain view of the world. And then, I also spent a lot of time, as you alluded to in the introduction, with a lot of, spiritual types,
Yeah.
conspiracy types, people in the UFO world, all kinds of other stuff that, you don't always get a lot of mixture between these different worlds. And so in the Silicon Valley community, the response was very positive because it's all about technology and how will it develop. So this is a really popular topic. In fact, I spoke at Google, right, while I was, when I had first released the book, and the talk went over quite well. Particularly, the ideas about AI, but also about religions and stuff. Although at the end, I showed them a picture of a spoon bending party that had just happened at the Institute IONS, the Institute for Noetic Sciences conference in Santa Clara, which is literally around the corner from Google. And at the end, they were like, "No, that's all fake. Spoon bending's all fake, but everything else we love." So, and
I
then
love it.
in the academic world, I got a lot of good response from certain groups. People who are like the philosophy of science, philosophers, religious studies, and other scholars. But the physicists didn't necessarily like it, but the computer scientists did. So it depended which community, or sub community you're talking about.
That's great though. I think it's great. What'd your family think? Were they all on board? Like, hey, get it on paper, man. We're interested to get more in depth to it because I know if I have a significant other,
Yeah.
sometimes I'll just go on those rants. They'll have no idea what I'm even talking about, but I just got to get it out. And they're
Yep.
just,
Yep.
they're supportive, but they have no idea what I'm talking about half the time. But
Yeah, well, in my case, my partner, she was very supportive, of
good.
the book and the ideas. I mean, she's not necessarily into the computer science part or the physics part, but she's into the spiritual part. So
That's
she was
cool.
very supportive, of the whole idea. Yeah.
That
And then
is
my
awesome.
extended family is, pretty much into it as well. So
Awesome.
it worked out all right.
That always helps a little bit. So how does the extraterrestrial factor, what does that play in the simulation theory or hypothesis?
Well, at first, my interest in these topics was, almost completely separate, right? It was like two different threads of interest that I had. But what happened was that the more I started to look into it, the more I started to see, areas of overlap.
Yeah.
And, in terms of background, I got involved in the UFO topic because I was involved, I was an independent filmmaker for a little while,
Oh, that's
which
cool.
was more of a hobby of mine than anything. And so, because in Silicon Valley, I was an investor and I'd help startups, basically, entrepreneurs take their ideas and turn them into real companies. And then I got involved in with some early stage filmmakers who were basically doing the same thing, right? They were trying to take their ideas and turn them into a real film, and they had to raise money and they had to do all this other stuff. And so there was a film called Thrive: What on Earth Will It Take? And this came out in 2011. So this is right around the Occupy Wall Street time.
Oh
And
yeah.
it was more of, I guess you'd call it a conspiracy movie more than anything, but there was a particular a segment in that movie that was about UFOs and free energy technology. And so I started to kind of investigate the topic a bit, and that's where I started to meet more people, who were either researchers or had written books in the topic. And then a few years ago, when I wrote this book about the simulation hypothesis, I met Jacques Vallée. So I don't know
Oh, that would be awesome. I would love
yeah,
to talk to that guy.
yeah, he's been, I'm sure your audience may know of him, but if not, he's been involved in the UFO topic since Project Blue Book.
Yeah.
He'd just gotten his PhD, and he worked with J. Allen Hynek. And even back then, he had a database of French cases that he was comparing to the Project Blue Book cases. And so we had lunch in Silicon Valley, which is actually where I am right now, just down the road. And this was actually, I think, before I had written the book. And he started to describe to me some cases that were just a bit odd, right? Which basically made me think, okay, there's more going on here than just the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Because what would happen, we said, was sometimes these UFOs would come in and out of physical reality, right? Almost as if they were projected a hologram, of
Mhm.
some type. And, he would say that there would be cases where one person would see the UFO and the other person wouldn't. And that got me really thinking, well, what could it mean if one person is seeing it or not? Well, inside a video game, the way that things work is, even though you and I, our avatars might be in the same room or the same field, they're actually being rendered on different devices, right? Just like now. I mean, literally, I'm not talking to you right now,
Yeah.
am I? I'm talking to my computer, and your image is being rendered on my computer, and my image is being rendered on your computer, and voice as well. And so if you were to take a rendering model where each person has their own, let's say, quote unquote computer, although that's not necessarily what it is, and it only seems like we're in the same physical world, we're actually rendering it differently. Well, in a video game, we do that all the time. We might say, that you're level 30 and my character is only level 2. And turns out that level 30 characters can have an ability to see, the dragon or the UFO, and level 2 characters can't. Right. And so to me, I'll say, obviously, there's nothing there because I'm looking right at it. And you'll say, obviously, it's right there. Can't you see it?
That's
and
honestly interesting, though.
it
It's a,
really is,
yeah.
because it starts to get into what is this shared consensus of reality. And then he told me about another case, which was really interesting as well. He said he went to investigate this case in Northern California or Southern Oregon. I don't know if you've been up there, but they have the big redwood trees up
Oh
there. And
yeah, definitely.
yeah, so it's different. I grew up in the Midwest, not too
Same.
far from where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very different landscape out when you go north in California. And he said that there was a case where these guys claimed there was a UFO that came down and landed and left, some marks on the ground. And he said, you have MUFON and all these other guys came to investigate it, and then they left. But Jacques, what he likes to do is he likes to stay and investigate and get to know the people more. And afterwards, he said to them, he was in the clearing with these big trees, all around. And he said, well, you said that the UFO came down at a 45-degree angle when it landed. I said, yeah, that's right. And he goes, well, if you look at these big trees, if it came down at a 45-degree angle and landed here, it would have had to have gone through the trees, literally, right? Cut through the trees. And they said, yeah, that's exactly what happened, but we didn't want to say that because it sounds
Oh,
crazy,
yeah.
right? It does not match our materialistic idea of the universe. So in a sense, the extraterrestrial hypothesis is the simplest explanation, but it also matches our current worldview, right? If you were to go back 500 years and say, oh, these guys, are from another planet or another solar system, they would just look at you like, what are you, weird? What are you talking about, right? That wasn't a worldview that was really shared. And then, Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler came around. And Kepler was actually one of the first science fiction writers. Not many people know this. When he calculated the laws of planetary motion, he also wrote a science fiction novel about characters from other planets.
Nice.
that's sort of the idea of taking science and then turning it into fiction to communicate it. And so I think, in a sense, even though most academics today are very much against this idea that UFOs are extraterrestrial, uh, in a sense, that's actually a pretty okay explanation that fits within their worldview, because we know there are other planets and there are other solar systems, etc. But we don't know about these other dimensions and things that go in and out of physical reality. But UFOs may be weirder. So to me, that almost seemed like in a video game, where if you played video games, you can render a character, but while it's rendering, like when the whole scene is rendering the first time, you can go through walls. You're kind of transparent. And
Yeah.
then when you get solid, like when the rendering is done, then the physics engine stops you from going into the wall. Like I can't put my hand through this table right now, but while it's being rendered, I can still do that. Right. And so it almost seemed like that there was something here that had this ability to be like a holograph. And I'm not saying that they aren't physical, because
Hmm.
many people have seen physical craft. I'm
Yeah.
saying that these physical craft materialize and dematerialize. And what does that mean in our material world? We don't know what that means, but in a simulated world that's rendered with pixels, there is a meaning for
Well,
that. And that's something that we can at least understand from that perspective.
damn, dude, I'm gonna end up going down a whole nother rabbit hole after this interview. This is gonna be great. So going on that though, so talking about the spiritual aspect of simulation, are you familiar with shadow people and the hat person known as the Hat Man in
I've
the
heard of them.
paranormal community?
I've heard of them, but I haven't gone deep into them.
Um, so I've interviewed a neuroscientist at one point who was pretty into the paranormal, and we had a whole long discussion about brain activity, how that works and everything. I was just curious if you did have an opinion, because a lot of people think that they are interdimensional, or
Hmm.
that that's one of
Yeah,
the theories. Nobody really knows
yeah,
too much about it. It's just a lot of theories, stuff like
yeah,
that. But yeah, i
yeah.
was i
Well,
was curious.
yeah, well, I mean, I do have a bit of a opinion on what that could be,
Okay.
because part of my research took me down the rabbit hole of different religions, and
Yeah.
particularly in the Islamic religions. And as I was looking at near-death experiences, and let's talk about the life review in a minute, because it relates. But within the Islamic traditions, they have this whole idea of another set of beings that lives on Earth with us, but that we can't normally see, and those beings are called the jinn,
Hmm.
or a genie, like the genie in
Yeah,
Aladdin. That
definitely.
means a single jinn. But so they're considered real beings in that tradition, and they come in and out of our physical reality, and they also live space and time differently as well. And if we don't want to talk about the Mandela effect, I can tell you an interesting story about the
Oh,
jinn
of
and that.
course, I am here
Uh,
for it.
and that was, in my second book, in the simulated multiverse, I get a lot into this idea of multiple timelines.
Good, good.
But the idea is that these jinn can materialize and dematerialize. So I was recently at a conference with Whitley Strieber, who you may know.
Hmm.
He wrote Communion,
Yeah.
which had the picture of the gray alien that's become kind of the standard way that we
Synonymous,
think.
yeah.
Yeah. And, in fact, I was at Rice University last year at the Archives of the Impossible Conference, and they have Whitley's letters that his wife Anne had like collected and organized over like 20, 30 years. And it's amazing when you look at these letters that people wrote back in the 80s. I mean, they wrote like 12-page letters, typed letters where they would draw images of what they saw. And but he told a story recently on one of his podcasts, and asked him about a young man who met this young woman. And he thought she was just a regular young woman. He thought he was falling in love with her. They had sex. She called him to her apartment one day and said, "I have to tell you I'm pregnant." But then she said, "I also have to tell you that I'm actually like a gray alien." That was the terminology. And she transformed right in front of him
Hmm.
into a different kind of being. And then she transformed back. And she said, "And I'm leaving, and you'll never see me again." Okay, now this sounds like a bizarre story, right? If we take a purely materialistic view of the universe, that can't happen, right? Either the person is a human or they're an alien, and that's it. Right? But if we take an avatar based view, right, you can change your avatar in a video game. But what was interesting was I found these kinds of stories when I was researching the jinn in Islamic traditions from the Middle Ages and earlier. to be fairly common, where they would say there was this man, he married this jinn woman, they had these jinn children, and one day she said, I'm taking the children into the jinn world, and you'll never see me again. And then she, just disappeared. And it's like these stories that have been around for thousands of years. You start to wonder, well, what if they weren't crazy? What if they were telling, actual things that happened? Today we interpret these as like aliens, or the shadow men, or the guys with a hat, because those are images that we might understand
Okay.
in the modern sense. And even so, I'm currently at Arizona State University, and I teach a couple classes on the simulation hypothesis and on virtual reality. But my research is actually on science fiction and how it influences technological innovation.
Mm.
And technology impacts society, and society impacts technology. And so, for example, like time zones, we use time zones, and we look at the clock very, like almost religiously in the US. And turns out that happened partly because of the railroads, right? Because the technology of railroads, they needed the technology of accurate time zones and timekeeping, so they could say when they're going to arrive. Because before that, it was just like, yeah, sunset, noon. I mean,
Yeah.
people did have clocks, but they weren't always synchronized, right? Across different areas of the world. And so technology has this weird impact on society. And so I think that our understanding of the world is making us think everything is aliens, when in fact it may be. Not saying that it's not aliens, some of it may
Yeah.
be, but some of them may actually be other types of beings that have existed all along, that go in and out of reality. And that with these shadow beings often appear at night, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what happens at night? Well, we're kind of half asleep, half awake.
Yep.
It's like in a lot of traditions, like the shamanic traditions, they do shamanic journeying, where you go
Mm-hmm.
into these different worlds, right? You go in the underworld. I'm not necessarily with DMT, just using drumming and breathing. Although, of course, there's the whole ayahuasca tradition,
Oh yeah.
and now people are experimenting with DMT and talking about the different types of beings that they encounter. But it's possible these beings are there all along, and we just have to get into an altered state to be able to perceive them. So that's kind of part of it. It's not a real full theory of what these things are, but I think
No.
there's some correlation. And I was influenced, I mentioned Jacques Vallée earlier. I
Oh
was
yeah.
influenced by his work. And if you see his book, Passport to Magonia, it has a really cool picture on the cover, one of the editions, where you see the gray alien, but with different masks that look like a fae or fairy from the Celtic traditions, or different, it's like they put on different masks. One of those masks could be, these hat men, as it were,
Huh.
these dark figures that show up.
That's interesting. The part that got me about the shadow people thing is obviously, I mean, they've been written about forever all across the world. I mean, before communication, or good communication, I should say, it was the same stories. And it's like, how are all these people from around the world who can't communicate with each other telling the same story? But then you have the factor of sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation is going to, make you see things, hallucinate. If some guy who's been up for, 4 days on drugs is like, man, I see these people in the bushes, I'm gonna be like, dude, just, you need to sleep a little bit. But the interesting thing is that they actually simulated. They did a simulation, and I think it was on accident. They were doing there was a girl, I believe it was in Switzerland or that section of Europe, and you can get the whole PDF on the study, and they simulated a shadow person, and she was seeing it. She was, they just triggered some specific part of her brain that simulated it. And I don't know, I thought that was really interesting. But you just never know, I guess.
Yeah, no, that is interesting, but of course they didn't necessarily have that kind of technology, way back
Absolutely, yeah.
when. So
Yeah.
how do you explain, all of these things? But yeah, I do believe so. As part of my book, The Simulation Hypothesis, I mentioned these 10 stages of technology, and one of the stages is brain computer interfaces. And it's this idea of, we have Elon Musk with Neuralink out there now, where they implanted in the first human patient, and it was working great for a while. He was able to like play video games just using his mind because he was paralyzed. And then later they kind of dissolved. So the technology is not quite there yet. But that idea of being able to read the signals in the brain and then to send signals to the brain, is something that is in our future. And so there is this element of sending electrical signals to try to stimulate different parts of the brain, and you might see different things. But the question is, what are those stimulants, and how do they happen? Personally, I've spent a lot of time looking at different types of dreaming techniques,
Yeah.
from different traditions. And it's one of the oldest topics out there because people have been dreaming, right, since forever.
Yeah.
And whether you're talking about the Aborigines in Australia, or you talk about the Iroquois, or the Chippewa near where I grew up,
Hmm.
and or the Maricopa within the Arizona, Phoenix area, which is where I'm based. Most of the school is at the school year this time. They all have these stories about beings that come in the dreams, and that some of these are real beings. And even in the Tibetan traditions, they have a whole tradition called dream yoga, where you learn to do lucid dreaming within dreams, so you can recognize that what you're seeing is not real, it's a dream. But then you use that to actually wake up in real life and realize that all of this is a kind of dream as well, that it's also a kind of illusion. But even with all these traditions, they still have this idea that you can go places, like you can have actual experiences when you're dreaming. They're not just sort of personal, like some of them are just symbolic dreams, like you
Yeah.
ate too much, and it turns
Yeah.
into a weird dream
Your
about
teeth are
going to
falling
the,
out or something. Yeah.
yeah, or you're trying to give a talk and you're naked, or you're taking a test, right?
So
There's
kind of
these,
along the lines of astral projection.
yeah, kind of like the lines
Okay.
of astral projection. I mean, I kind of like to translate these different traditions into big dreams and little dreams. Little dreams are like our personal stuff that we're working on. The Tibetans call them karmic trace dreams.
Okay.
They're just based on stuff. You probably had a dream where you saw something on TV or in a movie that made an impression on you,
Oh
and then
yeah.
later it shows up in your dream, right? They call that a karmic trace. It's an impression, and it gets resolved in the dream. So that impression was not enough karma to actually create a situation in your real life. But it's sort of like what we do in computer science. There's a process, like people who don't like program don't know about this necessarily, but there's a process called garbage collection, right? And we go through the code and we clean up stuff that's not really needed anymore, right? It's like old memory values in memory that aren't needed anymore. Otherwise, they're just using up space. And that's kind of like these karmic traces. They're things that made an impression in your mind that are not needed. But then you get to dreams of clarity, or what are called big dreams, which tend to be more like astral projection, where you're actually going somewhere and what you're seeing has more truth to it, or more objective reality. So there's like a subjective astral and an objective astral is the way that I like to
That's
think
pretty
of it.
cool.
And that's where, we can interact with each other. That's where we can meet, spirits of people that have died, or as I like to say, they've left the simulation, but they come back in with these kind of ghost avatars sometimes, to see what's going on.
Yeah, that's interesting. So going on, your feedback from your first book, how did that propel you to do the simulated multiverse? And in what are you getting in deeper or more in depth on, or just different topics? Tell me about
Yeah.
that a little bit.
Yeah, well, there were two. Well, first of all, when I wrote the simulation hypothesis, I thought, okay, great, I'm done with this topic. Like, I've gotten it out, I've researched it. I'd been thinking about it for years, because it brought together these different threads of my life, the computer science, the religion, the mystics, the crazy stuff, right? It kind of brought it all together into one. And I thought, okay, great, I'm done. I can go back to Silicon Valley and, back in the industry. But what happened was that there were two meetings, if you will, that stuck in my mind. And one of them was the wife of the science fiction author Philip K. Dick. And so I interviewed Tessa B. Dick. She's his, I think, fourth wife or so. And she's older now. Philip K. Dick died in, I think, 1982, just before Blade Runner came out.
Oh, okay.
So, he just started to see, because all his life, he was like kind of a marginal writer who never made any money. He was trying to always keep writing to have enough money for his family, right? But near the end, he got paid, I think, $1 million for the screenplay for Blade Runner, which was based on his book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. But anyway, she told me about a speech he gave in Metz, France. And in that speech, I had heard one famous line. So in 1977 in France, He said, "We are living in a computer programmed reality." And many people use that quote because he's like one of the first guys to talk about this seriously. Even though he's a science fiction writer, he wasn't talking about this in terms of a sci-fi story. He was saying, I think this is what's really going on. But then the second part of that statement was one that most people don't really look at. He said, "We are living in a computer programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed, some alteration occurs in our reality." And she encouraged me to go and listen to that whole speech. And so I did. I listened to it, and I found a transcript of it. And it was called, "If you think this world is bad, you should see some of the other worlds." And what happened was she also told me that he came to believe that this process where somebody changes a variable and reruns the simulation, he said we would be living the same events, we would be hearing the same things, we would be having a sense of deja vu. And that would be the clue that this is happening again, that inspired some of his work. And in fact, he came to believe that the Man in the High Castle, which I don't know if you've seen that Amazon TV series.
No, I haven't.
So this is an alternate history book. This was actually before Blade Runner. This was really his most famous book. He won like all the prestigious science fiction awards for it. And he wrote it way back in 1960. And it's an alternate history where Japan and Germany won World War II, and then they split America between them, right? The East Coast was ruled by the Nazis. The West Coast was ruled by the Empire of Japan, because those were the primary Axis powers. But the middle, like Colorado, was kind of this free area. But anyway, he came to believe that that was a real timeline that had happened. And he said that I had these fragmentary memories of America being a police state. And later, he said all the memories came flooding back into him when he had some experience that he called an anamnesis, or a loss of forgetfulness. But the important part here is he came to believe that this really happened, and it was a timeline that the simulators decided they wanted to run another timeline, and that our timeline where we won World War II was an alternate timeline, but one that led to a better outcome of some time. So this idea was lodged in my mind that if we could run one simulation, why wouldn't we run multiple? Why wouldn't we run it multiple times, right? Because that's when you run a simulation of the weather, or you run a simulation of any process, what do? You go back and you change the variables and you rerun it. And there's a movie called The Adjustment Bureau with Matt Damon and Emily Blunt, which was also based on one of Philip K. Dick's stories, which is called The Adjustment Team, was the original story, where these guys come in, they freeze everything, and then they make a few changes, and then they let it run again. And what you saw in this movie, they dramatized it. I mean, they changed it a bit, but they dramatized it where there's these guys monitoring what's going on in their little books, and they can see, oh no, we got to change something, otherwise it's going to go in the wrong direction. So this is not going to go where we want it to. But this idea that there might be multiple timelines and there might be people fiddling with these timelines was something that really came out of this speech that he gave about these timelines. So that was sticking in my mind. And then I had coffee with a friend of mine from MIT, who normally, other MIT graduates in computer science don't talk about this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I could imagine. Yeah.
And he had gotten a job at Google, a guy named Bruce, and he was visiting Mountain View, and so we had coffee, and he said, "Yeah, I read about your book. Have you looked at the Mandela effect?" And I said, "Yeah, I've heard of it, but I had just dismissed it as faulty memory." He goes, "Well, the simulation hypothesis is one of the best explanations for that." Mm-hmm. And so that sent me down a whole nother rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Which was that if we can have multiple runs of the simulation, could we be remembering like slightly different versions of individual things? And there's a whole, science, mathematics around chaos theory. And the whole idea of chaos theory is if you make little changes in initial conditions, they can have huge impacts down the road. And there's also a term that a computer scientist named Stephen Wolfram, who wrote the software called Mathematica, that's used by a lot of engineers and a lot of academics. Anyway, he was a physicist. He was a brilliant physicist who dropped out of Oxford because he felt like everything was too boring. And he went and studied at Caltech and did other things. But he came up with this term called computationally irreducible. And he said that certain processes, in order to know what's going to happen, even if their rules are deterministic, you have to run the process to figure out what's going to happen at step 2 million. You can't just assume what's going to happen or do a little equation. You have to actually run it. And so, I came to think, what if this reality is a computationally irreducible process? The only way to know what's going to happen is if we run the simulation and we let ourselves make choices, and we let ourselves change variables, and we see where it leads to, and then we may be remembering other runs of the simulation when we have instances of deja vu or clues, or we may even be remembering future events like, oh yeah, we ran the simulation and it went to this, point in the future. And so all of these ideas kind of came together with quantum computing, and that's what made me write about the multiverse idea
That's awesome.
itself.
Is there any Mandela effect that trips you up that you're just like, man, I know what I remember and this one's just not right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a few, like the famous ones, like the Bernstein Bears,
Yeah,
uh,
that one
is
gets
is
me.
is one that that definitely gets me. One that I didn't experience personally, but I feel is kind of an important one, is the Tiananmen Square. Do you remember the guy in front of the tank? They call him
Yeah,
Tank Boy.
yeah.
And so what happened with that guy in the tank? Do you remember?
Mm-mm.
Okay,
Actually,
so
no.
as I remember it, I think I remember what's the consensus view, which is that the tank stopped and it didn't run him over.
I
But
thought it ran him over.
right, so there's a group of people that think the tank ran him over,
Yeah.
and more than that, they remember very clearly that this bloody scene of this tank running him over, and said it was the worst thing they'd seen on TV at that point, right? Because this was back in '89, I think.
Yeah.
So you just really primarily had the networks. You had CNN too, I think, but so that's an interesting one because it's such a vivid memory. Of
Uh-huh.
course, I'm a movie fan, so The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Luke, I am your
Tinkerbell's
father.
one for me
Oh,
because they
that's
say
interesting.
that, yeah, because I just saw that one like 1 or 2 weeks ago, and I'm like, I know damn well she went around and dotted that I with her wand, on the Disney logo, and they're like,
Right.
nope, never happened. And I'm like, I specifically remember it happening.
Well, the
That
ones
and
that
Curious George was a good one too.
Curious George is another one, but the one that what really got me to take this even more seriously was the scriptural changes. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, but with the Bible, there are
Hmm.
certain verses that people say that have changed, and one of the most famous is in Isaiah, which is about the lion and the lamb, right? And I don't remember the exact verse, but it had something to do with the lion and the lamb. Well, it turns out if you look at the King James Bible today, it says the wolf and the lamb. It doesn't say the lion and the lamb, right?
I was
And
pretty sure a lion was a big part of that, you know?
yeah, exactly. And more than that, there are physical artifacts. People have like clocks and things that talk about the lion and the lamb. And it's just such a common thing we all remember. Now, the reason I think this one is more interesting is because people take their scripture seriously, right?
Very
And that's
seriously, yeah.
that's just one. There are many other scriptural changes. And so I began to wonder, okay, are there other scriptures that might have changed other than the Bible? Because again, at first I thought faulty memory, but then, with scripture, that's a little less likely since people memorize these things
Yeah.
word for word. And then I thought, oh, it must be different translations. And people are like, no, no, I've had this King James Bible since I was a kid, right? It's the physical Bible that's different, right? And so I began to look around to see if the Quran, the Islamic holy book, which came in a revelation to the Prophet Muhammad, had changed at all. And I couldn't find much out there except there was this one Sufi imam, and he was talking about this. And if you know, in the Islamic traditions, they don't just memorize passages, they memorize the whole Quran, like the whole
Hmm.
damn thing,
Oh yeah.
word for word. In fact, there's a term called a hafiz. It's like an achievement on the way to becoming a priest, which means that you can recite the entire Quran word for word and get it exactly right. And I remember wondering about this because I was born in Pakistan and grew up in the Muslim tradition. I was like, why do we memorize it? I mean, it's there. We got the book. Why do we memorize the Arabic word for word? I mean, not all Muslims even speak Arabic. But turns out this guy said, well, there's a reason why we memorize it word for word. And he said, because there are certain beings that are allowed to go back in time and change physical objects in the world,
Oh man, that's
but they're
wild.
not allowed to change your memory. And so for that reason, they could change a physical book like the Quran, but they can't change your memory. So, for me, and those are called the jinn, basically, right?
Those
So
are the
this
gin,
ties
yeah.
back. to our idea, because jinn don't exist in the same kind of space and time as
Yeah.
we do. And so for me, I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because
Oh
now
yeah.
you've got beings that can muck around with the timeline, right? They can go to the past. I mean, we've heard stories of jinn muck. So when I grew up, there was always stories of jinn, this, watch out, the ghost, the jinn is going to be there and get you at night. It was like something you used to scare kids. But there's actual stories, like in the Bible and the Quran, there's references to the Queen of Sheba and Solomon. I don't know if you know this particular story,
Mm-mm.
where she's coming from Africa, and what happens is he gets her throne, and Solomon brings it, before she gets there. It's like, how did he do that? And supposedly he did that through the magic of the jinn, who were able to go and get it and bring it to him. And so I started to look around to say, are there more modern stories where people could get jinn to manipulate objects? And turns out, they're in the Autobiography of a Yogi, which is a book by Paramhansa Yogananda, who was one of the first Indian yogis to come over and live in the US all the way back in the 1920s. In fact, I wrote another book called The Wisdom of a Yogi, which just came out last year, which is about kind of lessons from this book, Autobiography of a Yogi, which was like the favorite book of Steve Jobs. He had it. It was the only book on his iPad at his memorial service. Everybody got a little brown box, and inside the box was a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi. And in that book, there's a story of a guy who learned to control an entity named Hazrat, and he would tell him to just take any object, and Hazrat would make the object disappear and appear somewhere else. And he went around and abused this power. He used to go to jewelry shops and touch these objects, and then he'd leave, and later the jewelry would disappear, and nobody could pin it on him because it didn't happen while he was there. And I was like, is this, a real story, or is this just, something he made up to like teach us things, right? And I started to look around, and there are stories of these types of things where objects get manipulated and moved around. And so anyway, this is, tying some of the weird
Yeah.
stuff back to the multiverse idea, which is, was a key part of why I wrote this book, was I wanted to explore this idea that there could be multiple timelines, and we may have tried out different things.
That's interesting. That makes me think. I'm not sure how in depth with the paranormal you are. I'm one of those people. I got to go to the most haunted places ever. I want to see it. I want to experience it. I'm into it, but I'm also a very huge skeptic. Now that being said, there was what you were just saying brought up brought up a point that I had heard one time that some people consider. So there's different types of hauntings, like there's intelligent, poltergeist, residual. Some people believe that, excuse me, some people believe that it's overlapping timelines.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons is because in the Conjuring house, the original, all the movies are based on the Warrens and everything like that. So the Perron family told a story once where they saw like these old time people in the same room, and they were ghosts,
Yeah.
but the ghosts were looking at them confused, like, what the hell is going on? What are you guys doing here? And that, I don't know why that story stuck out with me specifically, because it's like,
Hmm.
I don't know, it's just weird. It kind of makes me, I don't know, it kind of adds validity, I guess, to the theory that it's like at some point maybe it's timelines kind of crossing over, and there's that thin veil and each one sees each other or whatever. But I didn't know if you had ever gotten into any of that before.
Well, I had heard about these things, and there was a computer scientist at University of North Carolina a few years ago, and he said he thought ghosts could be artifacts of the simulation running
Okay.
again the same scene. So when you think of like these different types of hauntings, as you said, like the poltergeist versus, but some of them are just the same scene being repeated, right? It's like
Yes.
the same
Yeah, those are what they refer to as residual, because it's
residual.
just
Okay.
residual energy, and they're repeating the same actions to us
Right,
over and
right,
over again. They're going through their daily lives. But then you
right,
have the intelligent ones that also
right.
somehow, interact with you
Interact.
or whatever.
Yeah. Well, so the residual ones, makes a lot of sense from a simulation point of view, because it's like I mentioned garbage collection.
Yes.
There's like data that the engine just runs whatever's in memory, and until that memory has been cleaned out, it's just going to rerun that scene again and again, and you see it again. Now, when you get into the more intelligent ones, that's where I think it becomes interesting.
Mhm.
Again, from a simulation point of view, because it's like they're two different sets of avatars, right? That
Mhm.
are running at the same time. And I remember reading a book from Leslie Kean, Surviving Death. Have you read that one? It,
No, but I've heard of it actually.
yeah. And in that, there's a chapter, it's actually by another gentleman. I forget his name now, but it was a chapter where he was investigating a particular haunting in Oakland, California. And there was an old woman that the boy would see. And you see this a lot, right? Where the kids can
Hmm.
see them. And the parents, it's not like they don't see him at all, but they see him a little bit. Whereas the kid was carrying out like a full conversation and saying, "Oh yeah, her name is whatever it was, Lydia. I forget the exact name. And she lived here and she died before." And then their son is telling them this, and they're like really weird. And they looked into it, and yeah, there was a woman named Lydia who had lived there pretty much since she'd been born until she died in like the 80s. And
That's
then
wild.
later, the ghost tells the boy that she can decide who sees her.
Really.
Yeah, so she decided, or that the son, maybe because he's more open, she's going to talk
Hmm.
to him more. Whereas with the parents, like they weren't as open, and so they caught glimpses of her, but she decided not to interact with them, or they couldn't see it. But there's some intelligence there
Yeah.
that gives them this ability. And again, in a video game like environment, you can have settings easily that say, okay, these people will
Yes.
see me and these people don't. And again, you can have one person next to you that sees it and the other
Yeah.
person doesn't. And so
It's like the
again,
younger you are, like the algorithm's not set yet. It's like you're still
yeah.
open to everything. And as you get older, like the algorithm gets you, and it's like, oh yeah, he's not gonna see nothing.
Yep. Yep, that's right. Absolutely. So I think there's some overlap here with with some of these. I mean, I personally tend to stay away from places that are haunted. Not because I'm skeptical, but because I believe there are other beings and entities
I do
out there.
too. I
And I
do
don't want
too.
them to come home with me. So
That's
I try to avoid.
it's a very good point. It's a very good point. Yeah, I love going to places and doing that kind of stuff. And
Be
like
careful.
I
They might
said,
they might come home with you sometime.
well, you never know. I got some stuff from some places. I don't know. I get to into the spiritual aspect, so I try to do what I can to, protection wise and stuff like that. But some people laugh at me. I don't care. It's like I'm into that stuff. It's like, it is what it is.
Well, people have been seeing this stuff for thousands of years, and
Exactly. It's like
maybe
it's not a
even
new thing.
tens of thousands, right? We
It's
just don't
hard
have
telling.
we don't
We,
have recorded history
yep,
without them.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So what is do you have anything in the future going on, like speaking events, any books that you're working on for the future?
Yeah, so I'm speaking in Huntsville, Alabama, in end of September at a conference called Doorway to the Future, which is put on by a gentleman named Tom Campbell, who wrote a book called My Big Toe, My Big Theory of Everything. And he's been talking about this idea that we live in a virtual reality for some time. He was involved with the Monroe Institute way back when they were first getting set up. And so I'm going to be speaking there, and I have an online class. Well, I have a class that I teach at ASU on the simulation hypothesis, and I'll probably offer that online in
That's
either the
awesome.
fall or the spring as well. And I'm working on a second edition of the simulation hypothesis, but that won't be out till
Awesome.
next year sometime. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, when it comes out, you're more than welcome to come back on again. I would love to have you. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, I'd be happy to come back on, definitely.
And for the listeners, I will provide links to all of his stuff in the description, show notes, everything like that. Um, but again, man, I cannot thank you enough for coming on and doing this interview. It's one of the better conversations I've had in a while. So
Well, thanks for
I
inviting me to be
appreciate
on
it.
your show. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I appreciate
absolutely.
that as well. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon, and everything goes all right for you, and hopefully you get some relaxation. You don't go down any rabbit holes tonight or anything, but
Yeah, I know I have a little bit of writing to do, but other than that,
all right.
yeah.
That's good. Well, thank you so much, and I will
Yep.
talk to you later.
Bye for now.
All right.